Also, I'll be timing you and will only unmute myself when 7 minutes 15 seconds transpire. Otherwise, I might unmute myself if you're not audible. But aside from that, I'll remain silent. Thank you.
Hello. Can I be seen and heard?
Yep.
Awesome. If you guys have POIs, just type it in the chat, please. Thank you. Okay. Starting 3, 2, 1. So we have two main proposals coming from opening government. Number one, we think a lot of these courts are going to be handled by religious leaders who deem punishment, the process, the rules and regulation of how these courts ought to operate. Number two, we mean opt into as a choice that individuals mostly have agency in the process of being able to opt into. Meaning, number one, we're going to make sure that individuals are of the age of majority before they opt into the court and their parents can't just force it on them. But number two, that they deem themselves to be like very religious, very devout followers of the religion, such that they're willing to subject themselves to the nature of a religious court then. I'm going to argue two things mainly. Number one, why it is like principally legitimate for people to opt into this, but number two, why this is better in being able to ensure that religions have a fair and like good process in being able to enforce their own religious laws and commands. The first thing on the principle is that I want to ask why people are likely to opt into these courts. It is likely that individuals want to follow their own religion to the extent that they understand they are following all of its rules and regulations, and at the same time have the capacity to ensure that if they are victims of certain degrees of offense, if they want to ensure that they can, to the maximum amount, have the proper regulation and enforcement of their own religious law, which they deem to be personally important, this is something that they ought to be able to do. I'll take you after my first argument, right? So I think what the note, an important thing to note here is that we allow individuals to subject themselves to other forms of external rules and regulation to the extent that they willingly and are willing to do that, right? So you can join an organization with new rules that you must be able to follow and that they can reasonably enforce with their own incentive mechanisms. You can join a corporation that can have the capacity to do things like give you bonuses or fire you in the instance that you A, B, C, or D. So I think similarly, and especially with religion, that a lot of individuals hold core and dear to themselves and want the capacity to be able to correct the religious followings, want it to be important they can tangibly follow and know the law of their own religion. I would say that this is completely legitimate for individuals to be able to opt into that often state mechanisms will not be able to do, precisely because not a lot of the religious laws are mandated or not a lot of the religious laws can be clearly followed. I'll take CO.
Would this particular court be substitutive to democratic courts, and would it increase and decrease criminalization as it exists currently in the democratic court?
Sorry, I didn't hear anything.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Yeah. Would these courts increase and decrease criminalization on existing courts, and would they substitute the current democratic courts?
So I don't think that's likely the case. This is an external court that operates separately from how democratic courts will be able to do it. So they will have completely different mechanisms and systems. You can still be subject to a normal state court if you're able to do another form of crime, etc. So the second argument I'm going to argue then is why this is better. And I want to assess the comparative. I would say that religions are likely to want to be able to enforce their own religious law anyway, but likely do not have the sufficient mechanisms to be able to do that. So my claim here is to say that individuals who follow religions are likely to take it into their own hands to be able to do their own subjective methods of being able to do punishment. Things like being able to act and maybe harm an individual because they want to break the law of God, etc. I would say this is likely to be not the case on our side, simply because they do not have a current moral authority to be able to deem as the person who will enforce this law. And therefore, on our side, once we create that, it is likely they begin to default to the court as a way of religious arbitration as to whether or not individuals will be duly punished. I think there are three reasons why that is a good thing. The first is that what religions do now as of the moment, and this operates in the worst case of opposition, where they say individuals might be coerced into it, they are forced into these courts, is that religions currently try and pressure state systems to be able to follow things like their own religious law. And I think the problem with that is they need an enforcement mechanism and therefore use the broad-based one rather than one they can use for their own exclusive group. And the interest for that is to ensure that they have that kind of enforcement mechanism anyway. Why is our world better in this instance then? The first is that when they try and make these like democratic courts begin to follow religious law, which is popular in the Middle East, which is popular in a lot of countries that are quite religious, it harms individuals who do not subscribe to the majority religion. It harms individuals who do not subscribe to the main and most powerful religion that exists within these states, and therefore simply breaks the main principle of democracy that ensures that everyone has the capacity to consent into these kinds of courts. And knowing the power of religion, that's likely what is to happen. Secondly, I think it causes religious conflict and divide, precisely because religions try and jockey for positions of power and political prowess to ensure that they have the capacity to be able to do that. And in that process of wanting an enforcement mechanism, they have to actively try and demean and vilify other religions to ensure that they become the most popular one and ensure that their way of being able to enforce their own moral authority is better. I would say you use up a lot of resources, you lose up a lot of popularity, but gain something on their side. On our side, you no longer have to do this in the instance that they can have their own separate mechanism to be able to ensure that they can enforce their religion. The second thing I want to note is that there's also a fairer process, right? I think unlike the subjective community punishments individuals are likely to go into, which they force people into, like gay conversion therapy, etc., I'd say on our side, it is far more likely you have a court system that follows things like the evidence, like finding mechanisms of the court, things like due process, etc., that I think are far more rigorous than alternative methods of being able to enforce their own religious law that local churches, local communities are likely to be able to use, and random followers of the religion are likely to force upon other followers of the religion, rather than systems that court leaders are likely to design from the very beginning and ensure that everyone has their own capacity to be able to defend themselves against accusations. Everyone has their own capacity to ensure they're innocent before proven guilty. I would say in the instance that religions still have an incentive to want to be able to enforce their religion, it's far better on our side when there's fair capacity to do that. Lastly, I'd say for a lot of religious leaders that are likely to interpret the law, they are far less likely to be cruel and extreme on our side and being able to ensure this. Why? I say there are two main things about religious leaders that make them more likely to do this. The first is that they probably care more about the macro scale of the religion, meaning they understand the position of the religion with regard to larger society and therefore care about whether or not they're losing followers. They probably care about whether or not they have a poor reputation and a poor image. That means they're far less likely to be massively cruel because individuals are probably not likely to opt into these courts. People are not likely to remain members of the religion. I would think random individual members of this religion who are likely to try and take justice into their own hands do not have the same like macro conception of the religion, do not care if they're losing followers, and therefore are far more likely to be extreme and cruel with their methods of punishment. But secondly, I'd say it's far more likely to have nuanced views of the religion because these religious leaders have studied religious law for a long period of time, have been subject to a multiplicity of different scholars of that religion, and therefore are far more likely to be open to change and progression versus basic individuals of that religion who are much more likely to have maybe like very literalist views of being able to read the Bible or the Quran, and therefore are more likely to be cruel, more likely to be extreme. And I think in the capacity for us to enforce religion, it is important to ensure that moderation that comes like I think only to the system that allows leaders to be able to ensure that this happens is far better. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech, Prime Minister. May we now have the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. We start in a second. So what they're saying is that the comparative is, if we don't do this, if we don't allow this, communities do that inside anyway to some extent. What we think is the difference in where this debate plays out is that we believe that states shouldn't be the one sanctioning and enforcing and playing a part in taking away your property or taking away something as a punishment that was deemed by that religious court in the first place. So there is a difference between your husband and what you're talking about is, or how do you say, your own father or people inside your community thinking and talking about like what morality of the church is. There is a different thing when you have a sentence with like the stamp that somebody said that this is the word of God and that this is something, how do you say, that is 100% the interpretation and in line with Christian, Islamic, Jewish, or whatever principles that you are ascribing to. This is the problem, because this entrenches and enforces much more conservative values in these kind of communities and hurts people who are moderate religious people the most. I'm going to talk about why most people cannot really opt into this, and I'm going to talk about this, how do you say, entrenchment of conservative values. But first of all, two main points of, how do you say, direct rebuttal that they're trying to say. Like, what they're trying to say is taking laws into their own hands. Just one additional thing. If this comes into something like this, physical or property or something like this, the difference on our side of the house is that you can sue if you don't disagree with your treatment. If somebody from your family or from your community is treating you somewhere, there is a state that is protecting your rights based on this. The problem is if the state is accepting these religious courts, you do not have this appeal on the, how do you say, civil, how do you say, society and civil courts in that sense, given that they presumably have to accept that this is the rule that you are agreed upon being judged by. This is the problem that we feel is bad. But also, how do you say, there is a they're trying to say, like, if we don't do this, then these communities will push for extremism, for more extremist interpretation for the whole country, right? And their examples are in the Middle East. Look at the Middle East. But the problem is, guys, that you need to read the motion, right? It says democracies. Majority of countries that you've given as your example are not necessarily something that you would even count as a democracy. Best that you can give us possibly is like India, or like, I don't know, what do you consider in terms of Bangladesh and Pakistan in this sort of situation. But even in that sort of situation, it's very borderline. Like, especially in the Middle East, and pushing for this is not necessarily standing given the prerequisites of the motion being set up. So they can try. It's unlikely that they will succeed 100%. It's still better to keep this separated to some extent, even if they're pushing for something else. Let's talk about principally unjust. And why is it principally unjust? Principally unjust on two main levels. First of all, because it's inherently coercive, and second of all, because trials are going to be unfair. Let's talk about first coercion, right? The religion that you are into is not necessarily your choice. Even if you believe or not believe, it's not something that you made active choice about. It's basically where you were brought up, what country did you grow up in, what community did you grow up in this situation. It's also tied to very special familial ties that are, how do you say, emotionally conditioning you to, how do you say, stay and keep inside of this religion, even if you could disagree, even if you don't like it. Also, the belief in heaven and hell, which is coercing you into, how do you say, with fear into something, and how do you say, into staying in this religion. In the majority of these religions, you can't really opt out of religion, not necessarily in terms of the script says that you cannot opt out, but there is huge cost of you opting out and not opting in to their policy, what they're trying to say, because your family is there, because like your community is there, and it's much more likely that you refusing this actually has social costs on you in this situation. This is where you're pushed in this situation, but it's much more likely also that imams, priests, how do you say, rabbis have a huge incentive, because this gives them a loads of power, like much more power to control, which is what they actually want, because they're losing grasp of a lot of followers. They have huge incentive to push and to make this message as clear as possible, that this is what God wants from you, that you're a sinner if you're not seeing this. If your son is not opting out in this court, they are committing a sin that they're not going to go to heaven in this sort of situation. This is the problem, because this even creates additional type of pressure on these individuals, especially moderate people, which makes it much harder for you to ever being able to opt out, even though it's hard to begin with in this situation. And also it makes it harder for people who are moderate, nominal Christians, Muslims, or Jews or Hindus in this sort of situation, who do follow to some extent religion, but are not fully hardcore by this, like by being bound by this court. Specifically, they're bounding themselves into some interpretation of religion that they also disagree with, right? It's completely fine for you to have a different interpretation than your imam. This is locking you into having this is your imam, which means this is principally unjust. The problem is, again, it hurts people who do not really have the ability to opt in, but also an unfair trial. They're trying to say, but they studied a long time. These are judicial scholars in the church, but what they are not is not legal students, right? There's a completely different set of skills and criteria that needs to happen if you want to have a due process fair trial. The problem is the due process and fair trial. The reason why we have it is it needs to be much clearer and it needs to be enforceable on how to say, consistent manner. The problem is religion interpretation is quite wide and vast in that sense, which means that it's quite likely that this is quite not familiar to majority of people how this process works to begin with, which means that how they say it's quite not great, but also quite likely to be dominated by actors that of how they say that want to push their interpretation of like Islam that they want. For example, Saudi Arabia and other countries that have huge vested interest to fund and to push this being like a precedent law, which is going to enshrine in law what did actually Quran mean and what is actually the interpretation that needs to be correct, right? Similar to appeals court, this is not something that you can really appeal because you view this as the word of God, as like conduit to God, or somebody telling you and God actually judging you, not necessarily somebody judiciary. The problem is you can't really appeal towards that decision. Let's talk about two other things like discrimination of women and overall reaction from non-religious people, right? The problem is the interpretation of this text, which is like being gone like for quite a while, is much more likely to be much harsher than like average person would be. Like as I said, like different types of Christianity, different types of sects have different relationship towards how harsh you could be. Does your daughter need to wear a burqa, hijab, or something? This is something that is inside of the house in this association. If this is something that is elevated towards something that the imam is actively taking the role in deciding for you in precedent cases, this is something is much more likely to entrench horrible views against women and what you need to act in a certain way. And similarly, the outside group that is looking into it, like already in the West especially, Muslims and minority communities are looked as weird, as somebody who's not understood by the majority of the community. If you have your own particular court, this is appealing to all of the worst fears about that community, that they want to implement Sharia law. The Sharia law is pretty bad, that they want to implement it on you in the association, which also creates less political capital for these countries to have, how do you say, different, more important religious freedoms that they need to have. That's why you should vote opening opposition. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. And I would now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to deliver the speech that's in their name. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible?
You are.
Yeah. There are two potential interpretations of the state of religion and the state under both sides of the house. The first is that these democracies are relatively secular, where religion does not have a lot or a strong state or influence, and therefore people are able to freely choose and are relatively detached from the religion. The second is that these religions have some degree of influence or a strong degree of influence over the particular state. Note that the case coming from the affirmative bench works in these two characterizations, and I think it is the conflation coming from opening opposition that makes them lose the debate. So I will divide my speech then into two parts. The first is to explain why in the quote-unquote Western liberal democracies where religion and people are relatively secular, why this is significantly a better policy to have. But secondly, why even in places where people are likely to be pressured, which a lot of the argumentation coming from the negative bench runs on, we are still able to take the debate over them. Firstly then, why do we think that in our side of the house, people who are likely to be pressured are, in the world where people are relatively liberal, where people are free to choose their religion, why should this policy be passed? We would suggest then, there are other things that people are able to consent to. For example, joining a debate tournament subjects you to the rules of an equity policy. Joining a particular organization means you can be sanctioned, means you can be put gag ordered on, or you can be significantly fined. joining any organization necessarily allows people to make a decision to potentially risk potential freedoms, either A, for membership to that organization, but B, because they themselves believe that it's important in their own moral development that they are enforced, or that the policies or the religion is enforced in that regard. We would suggest that under our side of the house, this is just a natural extension to how we allow any other organization to partake in this. What is their response? They said religion is different in two main respects. The first is that people are born into the religion, and therefore you're not supposed to be, like, it's different from people actively choosing into it. So the initial response to this is that we would suggest people are born into their communities all the time. People are born into their political affiliation. People are born into what kinds of jobs they have because it's what their family members inculcate into them. We would suggest just because other people have a potential influence on what your preferences are, does not mean the preferences you choose in the first place are necessarily invalid. But then they say there's this thing called the threat to hell. There's this thing called like the threat that you might be punished later on, and that's why it's not able for you to be able to opt out of it. There are a couple of responses here. The first is, to a degree, you believe it's incredibly coercive. It is unclear why they're okay with any form of religion under their side, for the reason that if they believe that this is too coercive to that degree, it's unclear why they allow any person to be subject. But secondly, and more importantly, we would suggest other things that you do. For example, a job. For example, even debate tournament do have threats if you do leave it. You're not able to get the glory for debate. Or more importantly, for the job, for example, you lose your economic security if you lose your job, for example. So it's unclear whether the fact that there's a potential threat or a punishment means that the consent that you have under their side of the house is necessarily invalid. All of this implies if the world is relatively liberal, we ought to allow people the free choice, and there's no reason coming from the bench as to why under their side of the house we should ought to not pass this policy. But before we move on, sure, closing.
At the moment, there are various social mechanisms that allow individuals to adhere to their faith. Is there any reason why there must be legal avenues through which people are held to their faith and not the pre-existing social ones?
So I think if you can see that there are social mechanisms for people to be coerced into forcing their faith, that kind of undercuts what OO says that you want people to be enforced at all or allowed to give them the freedom. But more importantly, I'll point out right now in a bit in my speech, that it's significantly worse to rely on social mechanisms than it is to rely on legal mechanisms for the reason of all the 5 reasons I will identify now. So then they say, under their side of the house, people were likely to be coerced. So let's assume the worst case scenario that people are forced into joining these courts. Note that if that is the characterization, the equally symmetric characterization is under their side, societies are relatively conservative and the pressure religion has on your life will still be strong anyway. So on both sides of the house, you'll be pressured. So Arth gives a good name for it, social pressures. Why are they significantly worse? 5 reasons. The first is what you would suggest, that they're more likely to be arbitrary. The fact that it is reliant or the enforcement mechanism is done by people in society in general versus a specific authority or specific individual implies that it can change from person to person, and it's just by luck whether or not you're punished severely or not severely, depending on how people behave under their side. Secondly, we would suggest that it is far more likely not to have accountability mechanisms. Note that if you have things like a mob raiding your house because you are like have premarital sex or you do things that are immoral to a particular religion, that means that the individual people in that mob are not held accountable to their actions, and therefore there's no reason for them to saddle down their behavior or like slow down their behavior, make it more humane, because there's no accountability mechanism versus a court where people know who the judge is, people know who are the people involved. Thirdly, we would suggest that to a degree that under their side, where they only have social mechanisms, religions are far more likely to feel a threat or alienated by the state. And that's what justifies a lot of the violent rhetoric that the state has historically been trying to curtail down upon us, trying to remove us from the public sphere. And that's why you ought to retaliate by enforcing, becoming stricter with the mechanisms that we have. Fourthly, suggested that a lot of extremist policies come from the fact that you have people who have to justify their position against the state, justify against the middleman, but to a degree, the religions already have a court mechanism significantly better off. But fifthly, even if both sides of the house, there will still be an equal form of punishment, albeit one in a not-judicial system, but one under our side of the house with the judicial system. We would suggest that it's better that people consent into the court in the first place, not because the consent itself is meaningful, I think it is, but it's not the important part. The important part is that people know about the offenses, and it's particularly codified at what are the things you can do, and what are the particular punishments, and that's why people in general can prepare for it, versus under their side of the house, where there's some degree of randomness, some degree of arbitrariness with respect to the fact that the social systems are not as codified, and therefore it is unclear whether or not people know what to behave, or how they're particularly supposed to act in a particular regard. This means that people in conservative societies are likely to be protected under our side. They say this will not happen because our only examples are the Middle East. That is not true. There are examples of Malaysia and Indonesia where you have rapid radical Islamist trying to involve the government. You have places like the Philippines where the Catholic Church has a strong influence, or Brazil where the Christian evangelists have strong influence over Bolsonaro, or even the United States where you have a lot of the Bible belters being able to influence the government. Note that the harm here is not just that people in the micro level are more likely to be oppressed in a system where it's not codified, but rather that there trickle external party harms, which also answers Arth's POI. The fact that you're far more likely to have conflict because other religions are trying to jockey for power because they need to control the legal systems because that's what they want to have as a mechanism for enforcement means that you're far more likely to fight against one another. But B, to the degree that one religion wins, they're likely to enforce that belief or enforce that religion over all the other people who are not likely to believe that belief. I want to note the best version of the opposition's argument, that there's a moderate line in this debate where they have some degree of freedom, but they're not completely inculcated by religion. That is significantly less important than the two extremes where either A, people are denied their freedom, or B, where people are likely to be harmed or abused, or houses are supposed to be ransacked, or they're likely to be shunned by the society because they particularly follow a particular religion. We give the middle ground that opposition is not able to do so, and that's why we're very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thanks for that speech. And now to end the upper house debate, may we have the leader of the opposition here.
Can you hear me correctly with this voice?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
This works.
Okay. Sorry, just to set my stopwatch. Okay, so I'll talk about principle, I will talk about practical implications, and within those two clashes on opening half, I will integrate, rebuttal, and respond to everything that was asserted by team in opening government. Let's talk about principle. Firstly, what does it mean to create a court? To create a court means that you create an institution which has a dissent at the end, and then that dissent has to be enforced. Who enforces dissent? This is enforced by police, military, and other agencies by government. What we say is it is illegitimate for police to come into your apartment, to take your TV, to sell it because you own $1,000 to someone because some fucking priest told you that you owe him for some stupid religious law that was codified 700 years ago. This is the problem. If people want to organize themselves like a debating competition, it is fine with us. It is not fine that a military will enter my house and break my arms if I don't want to comply with the call that was made by the court that is led by people who are incompetent to lead it in the first place. Illegitimate on three levels. One, it is opt-in. The objection that they have is that, oh, but everything in life, religion is coercive anyway, everything in life is opted in. This is very specific because you opt in that state enforces mechanisms on you. And this specific opt-in harms particularly the least extreme members of their community. Why is this important? First, we are mostly talking about Western countries. We don't accept characterization that many of those countries are democracies in a full sense. So what is important with this? Minorities in these communities, especially, the only community they have is their own religious community. Who runs religious community? Who sets the narratives in religious community? Those who are priests and those who are the most involved in how religion and religious laws work on their side of the house. POIOG.
Just because it's a private agreement does not mean the state does not enforce it. The state enforces things like civil contracts because even if it is signed upon two parties or private, the state has a mechanism for as long as people consent to it.
Thank you. But the difference is that state enforces things that was set by court, that was set by the state, that is run by a judge who has 20 years of experience and studied for 10 years law, so that quote that came in is being justified instead of some goddamn priest who doesn't know a thing about how law works or how due process is operating. So regarding opt in. So what? You're enforced to opt in into these coercive mechanisms because your community will exclude you, because priests will force you to tell your kids to be included in it, etc., etc. This is the problem with coercion. Second one is about no due process that Milos tells you about. They have absolutely no response to. In order to be a judge in any country, you need at least 10 years of working experience, how this process looks like, etc., etc. We say, firstly, they have no knowledge, but secondly, also these priests who are running religious figures have personal connections to people who are judging them. Okay, you're not going to travel from Paris to Lyon to be judged by some priest who doesn't know you. You'll be judged by someone who is already part of your life, which is illegitimate in the first place, because in order for court to be just, there needs to be this distinction of you personally not knowing the person you're judging, whereas priests are very involved in their life. So because we're not having fair calls, and because we don't have the fair mechanism to opt in, this policy is illegitimate in the first place, and this is the reason enough that this this should be banned, not allowed. Okay, we worked for 500 years not to allow these things, to happen. Second important part: how are these calls likely to be made? They're likely going to be made to be extremely discriminatory towards certain groups, especially towards women. What are we talking about? We're talking about things, to be very specific, such as abortion, which is legal in most democracies nowadays in the world. What is the comparative? Here is how comparative looks like. Some woman aborts. Now she's forced, because her father made her sign the fucking opt-in agreement. Now she's forced to go into religious trial in front of the priest, where they will have 15 other religious community members. We're going to watch how priest is shaming her for 3 months and inducing punishment on her for committing, for instance, the act of abortion or committing the act of premarital sex. Both things perfectly legitimate that should be allowed in society. We say that the very act of having a trial in this regard is extremely psychologically problematic for very vulnerable people who are already to a certain extent harmed, but this is just exemplified on their side of the house. No response to things such as that in themselves. But the second and more important reason is what I already kind of mentioned. This is the people who are mostly dedicated to religion, the most extreme people, the most fundamentalist people are always the ones who are setting the tone as to how these laws are going to implement and how the process is going to look like, and what are the calls going to look like. Because all religious people are, watching the most religious and the most conservatives among them and trying to basically copycat them. This means this since literally since the beginning of the world. Okay, what else do they tell us? They tell us if this is not the case, now Sunni Muslims will try to enforce Sharia law on the whole society, not comparative. The reason why religious people want to have power is because they're in general greedy for power. It is not because they have some, philosophically, morally correct truth that they want to judge their own believers. It is because it is in the human nature that they strive for more power. We accept this as an argument in every other debate. We accept it also for religious. We accept it also for religious communities. So even if there is Sharia law, at least this minor comparative is that they're going to be more likely to want even more, because they're getting that added incentive. When something is already given to you, you have this psychological incentive to want more, and you have pressure from your believers to ask for more because you see your government now as a weak. So we say there will be even more pressure on our side of the house, on our side of the house for these things to be implemented. And then they're saying, oh, but now your husband is not going to basically beat you up, but they will go to priests who will have better due process. No, we tell you, your husband is still going to beat you up if they're a piece of shit, but then you're going to go to process where priest in extremely conservative anti-women environment is likely to even punish her even additionally for some sins that she has committed, plus shamed her in front of the whole community. We say government enforcement is illegitimate in these instances. We say this is extremely discriminatory. We've been fighting against this for centuries. Extremely proud to oppose.
You're here.
Sorry, am I audible now?
You are.
Perfect. Give me 1 second. Three things in the speech. First, framing. Second, why this harms processes of nation building. Third, filling in the extension, like the analysis for this weird conservative argument we get from opening opposition. Rebuttal will be integrated. On framing, three crucial points. The first point is, I think no team in this debate has actually understood what the harms of legal sanction are and how they will manifest in this debate. I think POI was asked in OG, they never answered. I'm going to try to tell you what it looks like to overcriminalize and what it looks like to undercriminalize. Overcriminalization in religious courts will often mean that stuff like adultery, which is currently not a crime, would become a crime. Often this punishment can range from like really, really messed up things like stoning them, but it could even mean like incarcerating someone or fining them. Second, criminalization could also mean stuff like homosexuality. Courts would be, if religious courts wanted, they could make it a punishable offense if you were caught doing gay acts, which is something we don't see in Western liberal democracies. They never told us whether this would or would not be allowed. Under criminalization now, it would mean that stuff like female genital mutilation would still be considered not an offense. Marital rape might not be considered an offense against under certain religious codes, and honor killings might be permitted or not given harsh sanction as they would in domestic non-religious courts, because it is considered something that has divine sanction because something impure was done. This is the reality that government benches had to deal with as things that will likely occur, which they never touched upon. Second piece of framing then, where is this debate actually taking place? I think the confusion in opening half and a little bit in closing government makes it seem like this debate is sort of now taking place in the Western liberal democracies, which is correct, but it's only one of the two major theaters. This debate is also taking place in multi-ethnic states, which currently have unique processes that have created a balance in what the common law or like the common penal code is for everyone. What does this look like? In places like India or Indonesia or Malaysia, this means that there are common, like, and maybe this is just because of colonial luck, but it's common penal codes. That means everyone is tried for the same crimes in the same way. There's no special thing if you're a Muslim raping your wife or if you're a Hindu raping your wife. Everyone is treated the same way. What does that then mean, right? It means that even if you have majoritarian trends like you see in Indonesia or India or in Brazil with like a Catholic majority, it means that you have to compromise. That is, you don't want to be, you have to keep not over religiousizing your common law or your common penal code, because that could come at significant backlash or harms that you don't want to have. What that means right now is that you have a better balance of what is criminalized and what is not criminalized than you would have when all of these different religious codes can break out. What you would then see is a Catholic Brazilian code, for the very analysis that DPM gives us, being incredibly powerful and laying down offenses that aren't currently acceptable or wouldn't fly in a common penal code system. That is the kind of comparative they have to deal with. Now, first extension on nation building and why this is the biggest harm. I want to just wash out the sensible but very limited impact opening opposition case. Why is that? They're very limited because mostly it's about a mechanistic quibble over whether you can truly opt in versus maybe forced opt in. And the second thing is that they have a very marginal case between the social coercion about not having abortions versus the legal sanction of not being able to have an abortion. I just don't think this is where the majority of this debate lies. I know individual autonomy seems like a really cool thing. I'm not sure that's what will win the debate. Why is nation building the most important thing, and why does that get harmed? Two theaters. First, on Western liberal democracies. The reason why nation building is the most important thing is because if the state structures begin to fail, that creates the most amount of violence to any individual. So if insofar as like OO's analysis on why an individual's choice should matters, a nation not existing or public institutions being under incredible amounts of violence between communities or within communities is the worst kind of harm that would ever happen. Why does this become harmful in Western liberal democracies? A brief characterization of the status quo right now. Right now, what we see is that local communities often have some kind of social organizing that happens, which means that there's some kind of lateral, I don't know, some less clear social sanctioning system that exists. And these are often people who are highly conservative because that's where you feel the strongest sense of identity when you're a torn immigrant. That's where you belong to. It's often like having mosques, or whether it's having like your Sikh gurudwaras, whatever it is, it means that these are often fairly conservative because that's where the identity is most deeply anchored. But what are we seeing right now in the status quo in these Western democracies? There's a trajectory of social reform, but it's not social reform by reforming your religious codes. It's social reform by having more consultation within the framework of the state. It means having more integration because you have a younger generation. It means not having to worry so much about being Sikh and being American. It becomes more easy to have both identities. That is the harm that their side will have. You'll start splintering again what it means to be religious and what it means to belong to a particular country. And that is the kind of harm that we don't think should exist. Why is that a harm? Firstly, because I think when codes of religion happen, often the kinds of texts that they're building their precedents on, just like the fact that they were written 600 years ago, and that many fatwas since then haven't been the most useful, and that conservative clerks currently have the most power and most money, means that this is the analysis that opening opposition will. That means when these people who are currently powerful get state backing, get the kinds of tax breaks and the ability to set up institutions, they're able to push back against moderates internally, because from outside the religious movement, it seems like the state is supporting them. But secondly, often moderates aren't people who are pushing for religious courts to exist in the first place. So they lose the grounds to want to capitalize on this, and therefore they are less likely to be able to rise up the ranks within these moderate courts, as CG suggests. What this realistically then looks like is that often these courts will have horrible decisions. And it doesn't have to be horrible decisions all the time. It just has to be some bad decisions, whether that means a woman who was honor killed is not actually, the brother is not punished, whether that means that when a Hindu man sets his wife on fire on his death, when he dies, that's not considered the worst offense that could have happened. What this means is the perception of other communities becomes incredibly polarizing towards this. It's not just that these Muslims are coming and trying to create Sharia courts, it's that they have literally set up Sharia courts, and that is why we no longer need them in countries like the US or the UK. This means it harms not only immigration and the ability of these people to have social mobility by traveling to countries, but it also means that you can often have instances like hate crimes. These become new targets and centers for violence and destruction. It means more alienization, more Islamophobia. All the harms that already exist become far worse, and you deter and ruin the process of consultation and integration, of having more representative members within their ranks. If CG's extension was, maybe more brown people should be sitting in Western courts, yeah, you can do that without them being religious. Your case never told us why that was necessary. Second theater on multi-ethnic states before that opening.
So this case relies on you replacing the current court system with religious courts when people opt in. Given the answer of Mikko and the POI, we are not replacing them. Both of these courts can coexist, and it's an added punishment that you have if you violate particular laws within that particular religious court.
Yeah, but that still means that you will have some kinds of forms of over-criminalization and under-criminalization. The analysis just relies on the perception of external actors, whether that's white people or the majority, feeling like these people are really messed up and do some really sick shit in our country, and that's why we don't want them. That is why it'll happen in this particular way. On multi-ethnic states then, the fear of multi-ethnic states is that the other will get away with many liberties. This already exists, and that's the compromise I already highlighted at the start on why the way that common penal codes are made is a compromise of not criminalizing everything. What do we now see? You would see the kind of zealous over-criminalization I already highlighted in the framing exists. It means you have more distrust within these communities between members, because it seems that certain courts let their men get away with something. It's all patriarchal, it's all shit. It's just that it creates more violence and infighting between these communities. This often means that in India, you would have much more criticism of these barbaric Muslims who set up courts. We already see this in civil law, where the triple talaq situation was done in such a way because it was celebrated by Hindu men to be able to disempower Muslim, and that kind of same narratives of tension builds up. Finally, on the brief extension on conservative clerks, I've already told you how the precedents that these courts have already sucked. But more importantly, the way that evidence of fact-finding will be generated already existing in the Quran says stuff like a man's voice is worth two women's. It's already this kind of harmful processes of due process, which means that this is the real reason why conservative clerks will always be entrenched. The text just let them be that way. For all of these reasons, because this is the biggest impact, because nations matter more than an individual's choice, incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank the member